Hi, this is Alan McKay, and welcome to episode 101 with Ben Snow, a VFX supervisor at Industrial Light and Magic. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Okay, so welcome to a brand new episode. We just did episode 100, and that was epic. Thanks so much for all the emails in regards to that episode, by the way. I actually just carved out 2 solid days where I've been doing nothing but replying to as much email as I can. Since typically I read all email that I receive, but it's always a bit of a struggle to try and keep up with responding. And so that was something that I made a bit of a task this week, and it was really great. I mean, it was really great to actually get to interact with so many people and hear a lot of their stories. And I've also been contributing a lot of email and sharing some of my stories via email with my inner circle as well, which has just been really kind of cool the past 2 weeks, actually. So yeah, and actually, by the way, I figure I should mention this. I have an email list, which I just mentioned, which typically I'm sending out a lot of content to. I actually put out all of my focus on this list rather than posting a lot of tutorials, guides, videos, and other content publicly. I want to really reward those who take the initiative and seek out learning a lot more high-end, next-level content and training. So I've actually been sending a lot of content lately to my inner circle. And if you want to get on the inside list and not miss out on any of the videos, tutorials, guides, and other next level content, it's free. You can simply go to alanmckay.com/inside and you can sign up there. And you also get a heads up about special events ahead of everyone else and a lot of other really great advantages. So I just thought of that as I've sent out a bunch of really valuable content specifically today. And so I just thought I might share that just in case you're not on there already and want to join the tens of thousands of people that are getting access to all this stuff. So this episode is episode 101, and it's with the Senior Visual Effects Supervisor at Industrial Light and Magic, Ben Snow. So Ben is another Aussie, and I believe he was around the 30th employee at ILM back in 1994, and he worked on some really amazing films ranging from Jurassic Park Lost World, Twister, Iron Man, Pearl Harbor, Avengers, Pirates of the Caribbean, Noah, King Kong, Van Helsing, Deep Impact, Mars Attacks, and The Mummy, and dozens of others. And he recently finished up working on Mother, Darren Aronofsky's new masterpiece as well. So now I have to admit, I have been following Ben's career a lot, especially when I was a teenager. I think back in 1999, he did a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff for specifically The Mummy, making of videos. And at the time, I think I was like 16, 17, and really obsessed with that film and the visual effects in it, particles and other stuff. So seeing another Aussie, especially at ILM when I was still a kid, I was completely fanboyed out. So it was really great getting to chat with Ben about his career, insights, and honestly, I could have spoken for hours as he had a lot of really great stuff to talk about, and I had to keep it pretty condensed and to the point, but I think you're going to like this episode. Lastly, I think it's around 90 days left in the year, and I actually sat down 2 days ago with a pen and paper and mapped out the entire remainder of the year, mainly my goals starting at the top. So end of the year, I had a lot of really grandiose plans I want to accomplish. And in fact, I tried to map out what I wanted to accomplish in 2018, and then I condensed it back to 90 days or a quarter of a year. And I believe a year is such a lengthy amount of time that it's also one where there's a lot of opportunities that will come up over time. Things change. It's easy to fall off. So as an experiment, I tried to compact it down to about a quarter. And so that way, I think what I wrote above my 90-day plan was attack with urgency. And that's because to get a year of work accomplished in a quarter of the time, there's not going to be really any room for error. But after I mapped out my year, I compressed it to 90 days, and then I broke it down into months, into weeks, and then into days. And so I've mapped out every single day for the next 90 days, and it's brutal. But I'm also excited and kind of shit scared at the same time. But I will let you know how I go. And what's interesting is already I'm getting so much more done in the past couple of days because of this, because it's pushing me to really step up and make things happen, not just kind of like push or inch a little bit further each time, but instead really go for the kill and get shit done. So the reason I bring this up is, what are your goals for the remainder of the year? What if you map down 90 days from now and go through it with me? And if you need to, or you want to have like an accountability partner, email me your goals and I will gladly check in on you every 30-day, 60-day, and 90-day mark. And I want to see how you're doing. So I mean it. If you want, I want to see how much growth you can get over that 90-day period. So if you like, shoot me an email at amckay@alanmckay.com. So it'll be in the show notes, but amckay@allanmckay.com, and let me know your goals for the next 90 days. For bonus points, tell me what you predict of things that are likely to come up or get in the way that might cause you to fall off your horse. I think that by identifying these things, it really helps you become more aware when they come up. So not only is it good to put some thought into what are the things that are mainly going to derail your accomplishments and prevent you from hitting your goals, but it really helps you be more conscious of them when they are actually happening. So that's it. Shoot me an email at amckay@alanmckay.com. Let me know what your 90-day goals are. And let's dive into this episode with Ben Snow from Industrial Light and Magic. Yeah, if you want to give a quick intro just to who you are and a bit about you.
Okay. Hi, Alan. I'm Ben Snow. I'm a visual effects supervisor at ILM, working on movies and more recently both movies and interactive entertainment virtual reality projects.
That's awesome. And yeah, I figured to start out, I always like talking about people's origin stories a little bit, just because I feel like everyone's got a pretty unique story in terms of how they got to where they are. And for you, I mean, did you grow up in Canberra or?
Yeah, I grew up in Canberra in Australia, or just outside of Canberra. But I went to school in Canberra.
Nice. And yeah, I guess like for you, did you always intend to work in film, or how did you kind of fall into that?
Yeah, I always wanted to. I had become a sort of big fan of film. My dad was a film fan, and we used to make our parents take us to drive-in all the time. But I think they saw Chitty Chitty Bang Bang 14 times or something at the drive-in.
Wow.
But and Jungle Book and those 60s movies. So we were on a farm, and so Canberra had 2 TV stations, and we could pick one of them up well, and the other one you'd have to there was an aerial down in the paddock you would have to turn around, and it got terrible reception. But it was kind of funny watching movies like Lawrence of Arabia or Night of the Hunter on a small snowy screen and still being blown away by them, how effective they were. So I really love movies, and my dad had a Super 8 camera. My grandfather gave me an 8mm camera after he upgraded, which was interesting because you could do things like double exposures and re-crank the film and stuff. So I played with a lot of that at high school and stuff, and read a lot about movies. And when it came time to think about going to university or college, I talked about or considered trying to apply to the Australian Film and Television School, and talked about college courses. And my parents, who were both sort of vocationally trained, said, look, why don't you get a profession and then you can sort of run off and do this movie thing, and you're good at computing, why don't you do computing? And at the time, Star Wars had used computers to control motion control systems, and being a fan, I'd sort of read about that. And around that time, Francis Ford Coppola was using computers to control lighting and other sorts of things on films like One from the Heart. So I was like, I guess they have a point. Computers are everywhere. So I studied computing and film at the University of Canberra. And then on graduating, kind of didn't really do the film other than as a interest. I was part of the ANU film group, and I kept making sort of small projects with friends. But then I ended up traveling, doing the big, I think the Kiwis call it the overseas experience, the OE, or walkabout, going to the UK and spending 3 years in Europe. And during that time, I decided to try my luck to get into movies or TV or media production in London, and ended up getting a job at a small company, and then at Moving Picture Company. At the time, they had a 5-person 3D department, and we were doing commercials and corporate videos and stuff. And when it was time to go back to Australia, went back and joined a small company in Sydney, and then...
just to interrupt, like, which company was that? Because, I mean, you only had Animal, D-Film, and...
It was Conja. It was
Conja was the third. I was trying to remember. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. It was a small place. Like, I was the 3D department.
Because I remember they closed down in, like, 99 or something like that.
That's right. So I was there in 90... Like, I joined them in 91 and set up... They had been contracting out 3D, but I set up their 3D internal department, and then we hired a couple of other people, and then I went over to SIGGRAPH and ran into someone I'd worked with at MPC, Jeff Campbell, who was working at ILM, and he was like, that was the year, it was 93 by then, or 94, sorry, and Jurassic Park had just hit. And so SIGGRAPH was incredible that year, and every company in Hollywood was suddenly going digital because of that film.
Absolutely.
And so they were looking for artists, and so I sent a reel over, and they did a phone interview and basically hired me a few days later. And then I flew over as soon as we could get the visa sorted out.
That's pretty awesome. And I guess, like, what was the industry like back then? Because, I mean, I had just started getting into 3D about 94, and I actually grew up in Australia, and, like, there's no, there's, like, pretty much no industry around. There was a couple of places in Sydney, and then you had Beam Software in Melbourne doing the video games, and that was about it. So
it was funny, and the companies, when I was in London, the companies were sort of had a lot of rivalry going, and they started something that was sort of like a prototype of the Visual Effects Society. And so we went down the pub, basically, all the people from the different companies, and it was good because it started smoothing that out. When I got back to Sydney, we didn't kind of do that. So Animal were probably the big dog into Animal Logic, and we were kind of an upstart place, and honestly probably dabbling in a slightly different area. But, we were mostly doing commercials, and, we did things like the Beyond 2000 opener and that sort of thing. And I remember us going for a meeting with George Miller's company because they were going to do Babe, just trying to see if there was some of that work that we could do. And, our marketing guy was like, oh, man, we could just do this. We could buy the machines and stuff. And it was like, wow. And, it was, I don't know if that would have worked out. But, actually, I think Animal ended up doing a little bit of work, at least the titles and maybe some of the mouse stuff. So
on Babe, it was pretty minimal, but I think
it was pretty minimal,
titles.
but at least they got their foot in the door there. So, and that was at about the same time I'd started talking to ILM. So when I got here, at SIGGRAPH, you had DD, Rhythm and Hughes, ILM, and Cinesight, I think was the other company. And ILM was not openly recruiting. The others were really like, you would go to a talk and they'd be like, send your reel, come and interview, and that sort of thing. So, and I just happened to go to this. I mean, it exploded, and it was sort of fun. Like Maya had a giant party, and I and one of my Conja colleagues managed to talk our way into the party, and it was at the Nixon Birthplace Museum, and it was a ILM Maya party sponsored after they did Jurassic, and they kind of went crazy. Spaz Williams and others sort of were the party organizers, and they'd hired Timothy Leary, and there were fire dancers and, fortune tellers.
Very different to now where it's pretty much a ghost town.
Yeah, so basically that was a great era. So they were scouring the world for people, and, it was hard to get people. So when I started ILM, there were about 30 people in digital, and I was part of the intake that ultimately, over the course of a year, got us up to about 100. That was about the time they were doing Casper and all of the set of post-Jurassic films. My first film there was Star Trek Generations. And it was, just kept growing and growing. A couple of years later, it was like 400 people or something like that. And I think we ended up at something like 1,000 people by the time we got to the Star Wars prequels. And it was, they used to make this thing that visual effects artists were the rock stars of the 90s. I don't think it was quite that glamorous, but it was pretty fun. and it was good time. It spoiled us, put it that way.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting the way that the industry works now, where, yeah, you're right. Like some places you go, and instead of, hoping that you get a credit, it's more like the studio might get a credit. Again, ILM is really great at making sure everyone gets credited for their work. But yeah, it's definitely
No, that's really hard. And I
yeah,
work with a lot, because the work is much more spread around the world than it used to be. And
yep,
so it's changed, and it's not, there's definitely some good things with it, but it's a bit harder, and it is harder for people and artists working than it ever has been. I mean, when I during the 90s, I think I probably did like 2 Sundays or something like that, one on the Mummy when we were trying to get that done, and one on Pearl Harbor. And I mean, now it's kind of not that unusual
yeah,
at different companies, and even at ILM. I mean, ILM tends to have a bit more perspective than some, but it's still, but everyone's aware of the toll of that sort of thing now, I think, and so they try and be a bit more careful about it. But it's definitely, you've got these weird sort of crunches, and it was odd because when I got into the industry, we were all project hires, right?
mm-hmm.
It was like, oh gosh, are they going to hire us back on the next film and stuff? And then, it rapidly became digital effects were the only way to go. So, and ILM was actually really nicely positioned because, we also did miniatures. So when I say digital effects, I really mean digital compositing.
Yeah.
So they needed a lot of digital artists. So you were pretty secure there for a few years, and people were able to get mortgages and that sort of stuff. Now it's a much more of a gypsy sort of culture, I think. I mean, I and my colleagues, a lot of my colleagues here at ILM are kind of lucky that we've been able to be stable. And same with, colleagues. I was at Weta for King Kong, and colleagues from that also, it's been pretty stable. So that's great. But honestly, it's hard to, even now for us in the current film industry in California, it's quite hard because there aren't really tax credits and that sort of thing. And we luckily have uniquely talented artists who are really quite fast and also have unique skills. So, we're able to keep going and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, we now have branches in London and Vancouver and Singapore, and they're all terrific.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked with them all and visited them all. And, so it's much more of a scattered workforce. But I think the trick is, trying to keep some perspective as an artist that you could, trying to have some stability and not constantly be moving and stuff. And, have a good enough lifestyle that you're actually able to see your family and friends.
It's the holy grail, I think. Yeah. I didn't intend to talk about this, but because I usually try and stay away from the.
You can edit all this out. That's fine.
No. I honestly, there's
45. It's fine.
There's a few things there that I think are. I'd love to get your perspective on. Like, one of them is that you're right. Like, the industry is definitely globalized, and I think that, I just left LA after 15 years, something like that. I just moved to Portland because I wanted some rain, just a little bit. And but I do think that a lot of people in LA definitely feel threatened because it is a massive shift from what they used to. And it used to be that you would do all the work in LA, and if you wanted to send it to other cities, it was essentially you're expecting lesser quality and much cheaper work, and that's not the case these days, where everyone else is finally has a chance to have a piece of the pie, and suddenly you've got all this talent that's been hidden away everywhere that gets a chance to do their thing. And I think that there's good and bad with anything, but I mean, if anything, it definitely has helped the industry grow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's weird because our business is more essential than ever and in more platforms and more content. We've got way more animated films than ever, and we've got way bigger visual effects projects than we ever had. And so there's much more demand for it. But at the same time, the playing field has gotten more and more level and that sort of thing. So it becomes, it becomes a commoditization, I think John Knoll sometimes describes it as, where and certain types of effects, that's good. It doesn't really matter that much. But, what's weird about it is that you'll find that if you're in a higher end house, you might end up just doing the higher end shots, And it's kind of difficult then to get a spread of work that you say, okay, well, these are some, we'll just rattle these comps off, quickly.
Yeah.
While we're waiting for the renders to finish on this other thing. And it's weird. I mean, our goal is to, try and do shows where we do as much of the show as possible and that sort of thing. But even that's increasingly uncommon. And, so it's usually you're dealing with a couple of layers. There's usually a studio side effects soup. And then, if you're working for a third-party vendor that's going through a major house, you might have a couple of layers. So then you sort of look for those people to be really good at making themselves good communicators, get the message from the director. How do you get it to the artist as directly as possible? And maybe back in the 90s and even the early part of this century, we had, a lot of direct contact and syncs and stuff with the director. And now you don't necessarily have that as often. So it becomes a big communication game, making sure that we can get the message through.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking, but I've worked on projects where finally when you deliver the giant tornado that they wanted, they're like, I never even wanted a tornado in the first place. It's like, where did the communication go wrong here? So it happens.
That's a real problem, and it's difficult at the level of the studio to sort of know what are my ways around that? Because one of the tools I use as a VFX soup is to sort of pitch ideas to the director and to work with the director to say, hey, look, what you're asking for is going to be very difficult. How about this? This might, so there's a bit more to and fro. And that's one of the tools in your arsenal that you don't really get to employ as much. I mean, you still end up doing that with the people that you're working through, but you kind of end up having to hope that, they're not going to send you down some rabbit hole that you shouldn't go down to. I've been pretty lucky in that, I have to say, but it can be, I imagine, pretty frustrating if you end up, working on this tornado for 2 months and then it's like, no, I don't think we want that.
That's right. We want Smurfs, not tornadoes. What the hell?
Exactly.
So I'm kind of curious with, obviously you've worked on so many projects and I think we all have our kind of favorites. For you, over your career so far, like, has there been any real nostalgic projects that you kind of kept close to your heart?
In terms of, it's funny because there's two different things. There's the results on the screen, how much you enjoy them, and then the result of actually working on the project.
Which one you bled for and which one you...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Galaxy Quest as a film, and that was an interesting project for me because it was my first supervision role. I was associate VFX soup on that, and I had a lot to do with the creature shots in that film. And it's a fun film. It was kind of fun to go down on their set and stuff and with those actors. And it was one of my early set experiences. Mm-hmm. So that was really great. And then I had a great time on the Star Wars prequel, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. So I had my own unit and it was, you were sort of essentially here are the shots we have to make. I mean, those films, they were trying to do a lot with a fairly, they were trying to do it as efficiently as possible. And it was, every shot was an effect shot and we were trying new technology. Like we shot that film digitally and, there was a lot of different types of exploration going on. You met with George Lucas twice a week and, he was the God, he is, or was, I guess still is to an extent, the God in that universe and the creator. And so, what he said would go and that was kind of it. So it was a very great experience to work on that. So that's really warm. And then I really had a great time with the Weta folks on King Kong. A great team of people, several of them I knew from ILM. Mm-hmm. So, but I have to say I've been lucky, I suppose, on the projects that I've done. I just finished Darren Aronofsky's film Mother, which was, we were part of the project and it wasn't a big show for us. And so I was doing other things at the same time, but it was great to work on something that normally is quite different from what you would work on as a VFX artist. And I, of course, had done Noah with him, where we did most of the project. And so there was a good relationship there. And it was just interesting, different shots in an interesting, different subject. And so I found it really exciting and kind of fun. And Darren's a demanding director and has a very, you're going to do it his way. He's open to suggestions, and we were exploring things like, there's a sort of visual that happens through the film of this sort of organic heart type thing that's inside the house. And that was a really interesting art exploration and development exploration. And he really sort of draws it out of you and gets you to explore. So that was actually a real blast as well.
That's cool. And like, what was it like working on that film? Because I mean, I always find it interesting when you've got the typical visual effects movies, and then you work on other movies that, like, whether it's Zemeckis or other directors who might be very effects confident, but at the same time they're making Castaway and other films that are, definitely of a different caliber. So like, what was that like?
It's pretty interesting. I mean, when I joined NOAA, I mean, it's funny. Directors sometimes will say, "Oh, well, I don't really have a lot of visual effects experience," and then you look back at even Pi and certainly The Fountain and stuff, and you're like, okay, actually, you have quite a lot of visual effects experience. And Darren is someone who will tinker a lot. There's a lot of work in his films that you wouldn't fix it, or just trying to sweeten a shot, like a hair's out of place, and he'll fix it, or this or that. So Mother was interesting because at the time I'd done Avengers and was on set, and we had a big VFX team on the Marvel shows. You have, maybe between 8 and 14 people, depending on what you're doing at the time. You have your own sort of video village. It's pretty amazing. And so you go on to a lower budget film and, in this case, Dan Schrecker, who's a friend of Darren's, and he was an effects soup with us on NOAA as well. He supervised the look effects stuff. So he was, working with the editorial, and he was the studio side soup on that. So he was there, and he had an assistant. We filmed in Montreal, and there was a local person there. And they were kind of the visual effects department. So when I went up, I just went up because I was actually doing Great Wall with our Singapore team. They asked me to come over and help because that show just grew really exponentially in terms of the amount of work. And so I flew over from Singapore straight through to Montreal for the big effects scenes that happen at the end of the film. And we had like 3 units going. Wow. I sort of rang ILM and said, "Oh, hey, you need to get me an on-set kit." They had it. I landed at San Francisco, drove into work, picked up the equipment, got on another plane and flew off to Vancouver. And, it was a very different experience. So sort of, okay, oh, gosh, I have to remember how to program my own camera. I don't have 14 people standing by getting ready. So that was great. But I know that team, like I know Darren and Maddie Labatiki's DP, and I know them really well, and they're almost family, that group of people, because of NOAA. And so it was great because I sort of fit right in, and the shoot had been pretty hard and stressful. And by the time I got there, we were doing really long days as well. So it was almost like a week of not sleeping, but there was such energy and excitement about it that it was real blast. And it was like, you kind of sometimes need those moments to restore your, this is what filmmaking is about. So that was great. And then when we got into post, in order to be able to do the show, we ended up doing most of the work over in Singapore. But I just worked with those guys pretty closely on Great Wall, so I kind of was really familiar with them. And so the team that I had over there, which was pretty small, was just really good. And Karim Sahai and the production team and stuff were just all really familiar. So that was easy. And then we ended up doing some other shots that they wanted us to sort of keep an eye on, which we ended up doing with Hybrid up in Montreal. So I knew those guys as well, and so it worked out quite well. It was because it was small and because there was so much going on, we were kind of we'd sort of send material over, get feedback back. So didn't have a lot of contact, but then as soon as Darren had a rough cut, he was like, "Oh, fly over and have a look at it. Tell me what you think." And
that's cool.
So, it's really good. It felt like being part of the family, and was still demanding and still we're still hammering to get it done. But and of course the film's kind of interesting in terms of the polarizing effect of it. But I'm really proud to be able to do that sort of project, and it's great that Industrial Light and Magic sort of encouraged it and led it. And, Wayne Bilheimer, who was the exec producer on our side, was really saying, okay, we've got to find a way to do this, and helped clear the way, so I was able to do it. And,
I love it.
at the same time, I've been working on a VR project with our XLab team, and, they were great in terms of, me bouncing back and forward between the two and stuff like that. So,
how many people are in there? Because I know one of my friends, Maggie O, she's came over there from NVIDIA, and Matt something or other I used to work with in Vancouver, English guy, I'm trying to remember his damn name, but I bumped into him in San Fran one time. But it seems like you guys are getting, again, as usual, but the best of the best in town, so that's awesome. But
we have a really great team. One of the things that we were really interested in doing and have been looking at actually for a few years is trying to match the film assets and materials in such a way as we can just sort of much more easily use those as real-time assets. So we've taken Unified Surf, which is our ILM mega shader material that we sort of developed actually partly on some of projects like Iron Man 2 and Terminator Salvation, where we were trying to get image-based lighting up and running and physically based rendering up and running here. So that sort of has evolved further over the years into this Unified Surf that has really nice specular response and stuff like that. So one of the first things I did when I started on a project, and the first project that you'll actually see this stuff in is one we're doing for The Void. It's like a Star Wars experience.
Cool.
That I think has been announced. Otherwise, I shouldn't.
It has. It rings a bell. So
yeah. So
if I know about it, then it's definitely out.
So anyway, that's. I think we're going to have a trailer out for that very soon. But so we were doing things like taking assets from Rogue One and getting them running in real time. And I'm like, okay, well, I want it to look as close to what it looked like in Rogue One as possible. And so we were doing the materials work to make the materials match. And, it's actually been kind of interesting trying to really push this stuff as far as we can. Of course, you're in virtual reality. You have to run 90 frames per second. You're going to have certain challenges there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the funny thing about that is that those challenges are not unlike the challenges we had back when we were doing Twister or Galaxy Quest or those films in the 90s, because you're essentially trying to be really efficient and use cheats on the look. And the big thing that you miss is not having a really strong set of compositing tools. You can't rely on the compositors to fix it. We do have, the Unreal has some pretty nice image manipulation tools, but doing the sort of stuff we used to be able to do.
You don't have a real-time saber sitting in the background fixing all your comps.
Yeah, exactly.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Well, I was going to say, like, with XLabs, like, are you specifically focusing on VR, or is it more the tech that you're developing for, like, let's say, real-time previs and shooting things on set that's more kind of trickling into, giving it legs and taking it out into VR and other platforms?
No, XLab is absolutely into exploring the VR medium and some mediums. And I like the facts, though, I do like what you're saying. I like the fact that I see real-time being increasingly important to visual effects in general. And, we already see that with certain systems the different companies are using. But, real-time isn't going away. So one of the things I value about the work I've been doing with XLab is getting, more comfortable with those concepts and efficiencies, frankly, that they need to employ in real time. But XLab is really one of the really interesting aspects from my point of view is the creative involvement that we have in the storytelling and the performance issues and the experience design and the script even. It's a bit different from a normal work for hire situation. So that's really exciting for me, part of the XLab experience. And,
Yeah, no, like it's I think it's pretty exciting being in a whole new platform, especially one that, like, I was actually talking about this at dinner with some friends last night, and how, the first time I bought the HTC Vive, I paid more that day, and I don't typically play video games, but I paid more that day on games than I did for the actual device, just because it wasn't like typically where it's like loaded up and play Pac-Man or whatever. It's
Yeah.
every single game is a whole different experience, and for me it was more, I want to experience all of these different things because, it takes you out of what you're doing. And it's still early days, but I'm so excited for where it goes.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And the Void experience is really interesting because it's, you're essentially walking through a real space and touching walls, and the walls match what you're touching in or seeing in VR. So it's more, there's a tactile component and there's a very immersive component to it that's exciting to work on. But at the same time, we're doing, experiences for all different platforms, from mobile through to, HTCs and Oculus setups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just, it's a time of exploration, and there's no rules. And if there are rules, you kind of should probably ignore them at a certain point and try the crazy idea that you were trying. One of the first things I did was a 360 movie, really. I wouldn't call it a VR experience, which was a speeder bike ride that was tied into episode 7.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was, we did it all offline and stuff, but it was a really small team, and we kind of came up with what it would be. But J.J. Abrams was involved, and it was sort of learning all these. Oh, let's try this. Like, everyone was like, well, you shouldn't really. People will feel sick if you do. If you go uphill, and we're like, but it's going to be great. We'll go over it. So all you can do is try it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's like when they were shooting Black Narcissus or some of those films in the 40s where they were using Technicolor, 3-strip Technicolor and stuff, and the technicians from Technicolor would come out and say, oh, no, you can't do that. And the director would be like, I think it was, Powell and Emmerich did those ones, right, if I recall. Michael Powell would be like,
I'm going to smile and nod like I know what I'm talking about, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to try that anyway.
Yeah.
So, I sort of feel it's a little bit like that. You've got all these sages sort of saying, oh, well, this is the right way and wrong way to do VR. But I think the important thing right now is to sort of
experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the secret to visual effects and everything, really. Camera work, everything. Like, it's the ones who try the what if and, all the failures and the little mini successes that you manage to patch together to come up with, new solutions and stumble across things that you never even thought of. I mean, I think that's where the real innovation is.
You have to be willing to put it out there. When I was doing Twister, I'm someone who, coming from a programming background originally, really wants to understand every aspect of what I'm doing. And I don't like to make a change and not know how I got there. And so, but I was working alongside the artists who would be much more shoot from the hip and tweak this and that parameter and get something that was looking good. And they were getting pretty good results, right? So it was like, wow, I kind of need to sort of not be quite as precious about understanding every aspect of the layers of noise that I'm using to generate this effect. And so there is a little bit of magic, and it doesn't hurt to sort of just wing it for a little bit. But I'm still someone who prefers to,
do it
correctly and see it evolve and understand how it works. And, I don't like, when I'm reviewing shots in dailies, I don't like the shots that look completely different one day to the next as much as like.
Yeah. Like, I think that there's definitely something to be said about that when it comes to workflow, about, building things to scale and all the things that you take for granted, because the minute you hack things apart, they might work for that particular shot. But as soon as you move the camera or, move it into a different scene with the same assets, then everything falls apart. And it might sound like a good idea short term, but I think that, in this day and age, you got to do things right to a degree, because otherwise in the long term, you're just creating more work for yourself.
It bites you on the ass. And, it's like Previs is the big bane of that, although they've gotten a lot better, the previous companies now. But, I've been up in a helicopter and we're like, God, we were trying to reproduce one of these Previses, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? and you end up ringing someone and it's like, okay, can you open the Maya scene and see what's going? Oh, the plane's actually animating backwards at 600 miles an hour. And yeah, it's like, oh.
Doesn't really help.
That you definitely need to. But if you're doing an art project, and that was one of the great things about Mother, was that, you had these really, what the hell is it, type effects. And this is kind of more of a metaphor or an allegory. And so, we wanted to feel realistic as possible, but in the end, we're doing something that maybe isn't physically a real thing.
Right.
So, and it's more of an art project. And so you find it's interesting because it's when I'm crewing a show or trying to choose artists to work on it, you kind of tend to then say, okay, well, this sort of artist is really good at that. They might not be generating the system that you can scale infinitely that'll work, but their individual shots look great, and I only have 3 shots like that. So, that's the person I need for this. So it is an interesting thing when you get to a more esoteric and avant-garde or abstract type phenomenon.
And that's actually one, like, jumping all around here, but that's one question I was going to ask about later on, was going to be, for you when you're starting a new project, like, how do you typically staff your teams? Do you handpick the leads and other soups to work on your projects, or how does that typically come together for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the advantage of working at a company like ILM with a team of people that you've worked with for years, is that you have different people that you know and stuff. And of course, there's always artists and leads that are in demand by every single, show. But then there's also some really great artists and leads that are not necessarily always the go-to people for everyone. And so you end up usually having a few people that are kind of your team, that you kind of know that you can rely on. And
property of Ben Snow
that you run into, eh?
I said property of Ben Snow.
Yeah, well, I always have tried in the past to say, "Oh, keep this person a secret," sort of thing. But it's crazy. And actually, one great thing about ILM is that the production managers here do a really concerted effort to try and be fair and spread work across the projects pretty well. So, I find then that I do tend to like working with petite people that maybe sometimes are idiosyncratic. So I'm like, okay, well, I kind of am happy to work with this person, and, they're really talented. So, that works sometimes, but it's not such a problem here with that. But it is good to have certain people that maybe, you can sort of rely on. And honestly, the production managers kind of know, okay, he's going to ask for this person, this person, this person. But it's kind of odd now because in the environment that we're in, where San Francisco isn't always the hub now, it might be London or Vancouver. And we're often, I might be doing a whole show here in the past. And even Noah, I would say it was a split just between San Francisco and Singapore, which was amazing. I mean, I can't imagine even today just being able to do something like that often. If it was a San Francisco-based show. But, it's a different set of things. And I was talking to Charlie Gibson, an FX soup that I worked with on a couple of films, Terminator Salvation and Pirates of the Caribbean. And I was like, I don't get how you'd stand it, because I really like working with the artists side by side, and I really feel like I understand their talents and stuff. And he said, well, and I now know this to be true, having worked with third-party vendors and stuff, you end up making those alliances with people in these third-party companies, and you kind of get to know them and you trust them, and it's a similar thing. But I don't know. Sometimes there's nothing that beats being able to walk up to an artist's desk and have them say, "Oh yeah, I have this here," and ask you a question, and you're able to answer it and just move on. I mean, that's still by far my preferred way of working. But in the global world that we're in, it's not often the case. So you end up looking at different systems, and I do a lot of video captures and stuff, and bring up the shot in RV and then do a video capture where I sort of talk through the work, and then get really good at writing notes as well.
Well, just to talk about that for 1 second, but like, because I'm always fascinated by remote working, and for me, like, the reason I left LA was because even when I was working like with a studio that's literally 3 or 4 doors down from where I am, I would still work from my office, my pipeline a lot of the time. And so for me, I've always been obsessed by that. And obviously, you guys had the pod for a while experimenting with that.
Yeah.
And for you, what are some of the things you find work really effectively for either communicating with remote workers or just in general, like having people facilitated all over the world?
It's interesting because one of the things that was odd for me was, for example, when I was still doing, reviewing shots on Great Wall when I went off to the shoot for Mother. It's interesting. You end up doing a bunch of tools because one thing that happens is your support team in the studio is going to be smaller, right? Because you're now got a support team that the vendor has in place. So what I would do, and I was reviewing base effects in China. I was doing a lot of work with them. So I think a couple of things are important. Number one, for the supervisor, I think it's actually really important to go over and visit. There was a really terrific presentation one of the games companies did, and they came and visited ILM and did a presentation when we were just getting into using third-party people for different things. And they did this presentation about how to talk to your third-party people, and it was pretty funny presentation, and their best slide was a slide of some steins of beer. And they're like, okay, beer is the secret. You basically have to fly over and go down the pub or go out to dinner or just socialize.
So true.
People so that you understand there's a human there and that they understand there's a human on the other end and stuff like that. And I have to admit, early on, I was not necessarily that keen to jump on a plane and go, even though, coming from Australia, I should be used to that, right? But, when I did that, when they asked me to help out on Great Wall, I flew over to base and spent a couple of weeks over there, and it really helped. I got enough, you hit it off with the people or you get to know their personalities a little bit and it just relaxes things. So what we used in that case was I found ILM uses a version of Aspera called Speederbike. So it's really just a flavor of Aspera. And it means that you can do really fast transfers. So, we also have a very good internal review system set up so that they can, any third party that we work in, the artist can submit a review and it'll go straight into my queue. I have a review queue. And so I can actually pretty quickly, it needs to be ingested, it needs to get a production tracking number and all that sort of thing. But our internal system allows me to pretty quickly then look at the shot and give feedback and even annotate frames and drop those into the review queue. So I use that a lot when I'm in the facility. When I'm not in the facility, I like I'm on set or something else, I will ask them. I'll have a couple of approaches. One will be they'll speed a bike shots to me as well as submit them through the formal system, and then I wrote a bunch of tools myself that allowed me to ring it, dial up, and VPN into work, and then compress everything to MP4s because you'd sometimes be somewhere where the hotel internet is terrible.
Yeah.
So I had different levels of compression depending on how crappy the internet was, and so I just pull them all up through my system. I'm VPNing in and getting maybe 4 frames a second playback, but I'm able to then save out an RV list and convert that, and then speed a bike it to myself.
That's cool.
Then the production team will prepare me a spreadsheet which has the shot submission. Okay, no worries. Sorry, someone's just helping me out with the problem here. They would send me a shot submission that we'd get the last round. I'd have them put in the shot submission, the last round of client notes, the last notes I gave, and the last notes that the submission notes. And then I would just go through shot by shot on my laptop and type notes in the thing. And then, I try and do calls. I feel like it's better to do at least 1 or 2 a week, usually 2 a week, I would say. And when you're working with a studio side soup, sometimes you'll do formal reviews, but it's probably worth, I think, doing at least a touch base via phone. On Mother, it was interesting to me because Dan Schrecker was the thing and we friendly and stuff. So we would just FaceTime each other all the time. And actually, I like having the visual contact. I mean, we do a lot of things where it's by phone with a CineSync, and that's great. Obviously, you do a lot of reviews in CineSync, but seeing the person's face makes a big difference to me, I think. And even in the way they deport themselves and stuff, like I did, I helped out on a Michael Bay film, 13 Hours. Yeah. So I was helping out on a Michael Bay film, 13 Hours. And, I actually, Michael can be pretty rough in the CineSyncs, but, having that sort of contact and direct contact, where you're looking into the editing room really sort of helps, I think, everyone just, get on okay and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I do like a visual if I'm doing a review, if I possibly can. But
that's cool.
It's not always possible.
Do the best you can with what you got.
Yeah, exactly.
And I want to be respectful of your time, but I'll ask a couple more questions if you don't mind. So just, you mentioned King Kong before, and I figured that would be a good one. I actually attended Digital Media Festival where you're speaking about King Kong in Sydney, I guess 06.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that was fun. So, I remember you talking about the brontosauruses and showing a bunch of the tests and some of the fails and all the ones in between. So that looked like a lot of fun. But for you, coming from spending so much time at ILM and then let's say going to Weta, for instance, what was it? How the two compare in terms of like workflow pipeline? Did you find that growing up at one place and then seeing how the other half live, like, did you find that most places were doing the same workflow, same approach to things, or was it very unique and kind of like, wow, here's a fresh look at how people might approach things? Or
well, at Weta, actually, when I got there, so I had worked with Joe Lettieri at ILM, but oddly enough, he was in a sort of CTO type role when I most closely worked with him.
Right.
I was doing the film Pearl Harbor, another Michael Bay film, and he was sort of actually had taken over sort of doing some of the sort of technical sort of stuff. So I said, look, I want to use the animation super, and I talked about it, and we decided we wanted to use Maya. So we decided it was Scott Benzer and I, and he decided I was an associate effects soup. Eric Breivik was the soup. But I was sort of technically deciding what we wanted to do, sort of the lead CG guy on it as well. And we decided we wanted to use Maya, and Joe really sort of championed us. And Pearl Harbor was also a film where we pushed, we introduced ambient occlusion. So we were starting to use image-based techniques a little bit more. So, and he'd sort of really championed that. So I really wanted to work on King Kong. I was a huge fan of the 33 movie. And so I sort of called Joe, and he said, look, it's going to be a small shot, 800 shots or so. But, I definitely could use some help. I'm sort of spending long hours here. Maybe, you could take over some of the stuff and I can actually get back to doing a bit of shader writing and stuff I really love. But, okay, fine. So at that time, when I was there for King Kong, and this was probably the last time it was like that, Weta was still a one-show shop. So everyone was working pretty much on King Kong. So that was very different from ILM, where it was like by the time I left, we were doing, I think 2 or 3 at least large shows at a time. So we'd sort of made an effort back at ILM to sort of very much consolidate the pipeline so artists could easily jump between different shows and not be completely at sea, which was a problem when we all started in the 90s. You would go onto a new show and you'd have to basically relearn everything. So Weta was rewriting their pipeline on every show at that time. But because Joe is ex-ILM and Ken McGaw, who's a VFX soup, who's I think now back at Weta, he wrote the version of the pipeline I got to use at Weta, and we'd worked really closely together. Ken was one of the people who helped us develop ambient occlusion on Pearl Harbor. So we kind of all knew each other. Chris White was there. He was also someone I worked with. He was on Twister. So a lot of the CG soup level people and and Joe and so forth were from an ILM mindset. So it wasn't actually very hard for me to jump in there.
Right.
I found their system more agile, and I was able to sort of get things changed. And the other thing was that Joe was, and probably still is to an extent, I imagine, pretty much calling the shots. And so if you could say, hey, I want this, and Joe agreed with you, then it would get done. Here, we have, probably, and it's possibly like that there now, honestly. It's 10 years ago, right? But we have multiple supervisors, all of which have their own different things. And, hey, now I'm even there coming from there. Well, okay, I need this to work in real time. So we've all got very different needs. And so in that case, there has to be a conversation, and you have to say, okay, well, who's going to win out in this case? Or you find a way to do it within the show resources, which is still a really great way to do R&D, in my opinion, is to sort of do it in the show. But the problem with that is you kind of want your R&D efforts to migrate back into the greater good. So it's a balance. So yeah, I found the fact that there was a familiarity from the ILM, but there was an agility to their pipeline that I really valued. And I think since coming back to ILM, we've gotten a bit more agile in many ways as well. But it was funny because I came back and they'd switched their entire pipeline here to a Xeno-based pipeline, which actually ended up being tremendously powerful. But, we switch our pipeline every few years, and I've been involved in, I would say, 3 or 4 of those rewrites at different times over the years. So, and now I'm in a completely different setup again. So it's kind of, it's something, unfortunately, it's a fact of life for us in the VFX world, isn't it?
Yeah, you got to evolve. That's cool. That's really great. And I guess just to throw a few projects at you, but like Mummy, Pearl Harbor, a couple projects like that. I mean, for you, what were some of the big challenges on those particular projects?
So Mummy was a really fun one. I forgotten what I've done just before then, but Wild Wild West was the other big show that was in town. And I remember the producer of that saying, "Why on earth are you choosing Mummy over Wild Wild West?" And I was like, I love horror movies. And and John Burton, the soup on that show, I really liked him. And Mummy was a blast, but great team. That was a really good, when you start on a show and you have a small team just trying to get the assets working and work out how the hell you're going to do the show. And at that time we were trying to write, new pipeline tools, assets. It was one of the first times we wrote asset management tools. We were trying to get motion capture up and running so that we could get real-time feedback for the motion capture. We did a lot of motion capture on that show, and they set up a portable motion capture stage at Shepperton so that the director could work with the actors over there in London. And so there was a lot of new ground being broken on that film, and so that made it really exciting. And so the challenge there was to try and get, the mummy itself, the believable, or trying to make him as believable as we could at the time. We did a lot with Flesh Sim and stuff that, when you think about it, there weren't that many shots ultimately back then, but it was just a lot of fun. And the director, Stephen Summers, was a blast to work with, and the team there. So I did a bit of set work. I was CG soup on that show, but I was sort of more interested in getting set experience than necessarily pushing for an associate VFX type credit. I was like, okay, as long as I get a chance, at least send me to set for a week or something like that. So I got some set time, and then we got a lot of time with the director and stuff like that. So that was a great fun. And honestly, I still enjoy the movie when it's on TV. It's still one I'm very proud of.
I think that one, it's it's not the highest caliber film, but it's just a fun one,
It's fun, and it's actually, it's well made. There's definitely a cheesy aspect to it that I would say, as an Indiana Jones type adventure film, I'd prefer it to some Indiana Jones sequels personally, but
exactly.
Can I even say that as a Lucasfilm? But I do. And Pearl Harbor was, that was really interesting because lighting wise and materials wise, we were really pushing a lot of technology, and I got a lot of backing from ILM to really explore that. And we were able to throw in ideas like Hayden Landis came to me and sort of said, I was trying to get, Ken McGaw was working on we were trying to ray trace an entire battleship, and the ray tracers that we had available to us just would choke on the sort of detailed asset that we were building at the time. So Ken spent about a month trying to get that up and running. And then Hayden, at the same time, one of the things that Bay had been skeptical about was our ability to realistically light an aeroplane. And Hayden said, oh, look, why don't I was thinking maybe we could use the reflection map to light the aeroplane. And I said, you know what? I'd actually discussed that back on, it might have been just the previous film, Galaxy Quest, because we had this rock monster in that film.
Yeah.
It was just a nightmare because it ended up looking really ambient. And we were trying to work out how could we get what you would get from indirect lighting more accurately using tools that you could actually afford to render with. And so we talked about doing that on that. And the problem that we couldn't solve was occlusion, right? How do you shadow properly in that sort of. So Hayden said, look, I've been talking to Ken about this. Ken was doing the indirect stuff on the ship, and we feel like there might be a way we can bake an indirect pass onto the plane. And so I said, yep, let's go for it. And so they spent a couple of weeks just experimenting. And on Pearl Harbor, we kind of had not the luxury, but we did have the resources to do that because we had so much. It was such a scary project going in. We were going to have to create giant smoke plumes and stuff. And so we had quite a lot of R&D resource and some time to really experiment. So it was really fun in that way. But it's also a bit of a bittersweet film in many ways for me because Titanic had come out and Speed 2. So those were the two big boat films that had preceded Pearl Harbor. And we'd done Speed 2, and there was some pretty good work in that. But I felt that the miniature work in Titanic with the ship held up better than the CG work in some of the CG shots, at least in Speed 2. And honestly, I came to ILM to work with miniatures. I wasn't, a CG fan particularly. It was like, right. I love visual effects. So a lot of the project, I look for opportunities to work with the practical effects and the motion control team. In fact, on all of my projects when they were part of ILM, even as a supervisor, I was able to always work with them. Even on Star Wars, we built the droid factory. A lot of that was miniature and stuff. So we built these two beautiful battleship models, and we were trying to work out how to film this, and filming in Marin County in January, February, outside, which we felt was necessarily the realism, you start getting plagued by wind and rain and storms. And then we got the helicopter plates back from Hawaii, and these are giant, elaborate moves. So we put a lot of work into coming up with how do we match move those and then get that data out to the stage, and that was kind of working, but it wasn't really. But then we had these two shots of the Arizona ship exploding that we kind of knew we had to do in CG, and they were pretty close on the ship. So we essentially were focusing our CG R&D efforts on the ship on those two shots. And when we nailed them in those shots, Eric Brevig, the effects soup, came to me and sort of said, okay, the ship's looking, pretty much as well. Actually, it was as good as the miniature is looking in these situations. We are going to be able to track that in. And he knew that I was desperately trying to keep hold to the miniatures. I'd done all this planning on how we could shoot them. And I really loved the miniature team and the motion control team that we're working with. And he's like, I think in the end we're not going to.
Oh, man.
I think we're going to have to go with the CG because we're never going to get these things to track in based on the motion control tests that we've done and the fact that the CG ships were actually looking pretty great. So the sorts of shots Michael had in mind.
Yeah, very elaborate camera moves for sure.
And you would have had to do, then you're talking about 8 passes because there's 8 battleships and redressing the battleship between each passer, all of that sort of thing. So I just remember going over to the model shop and telling the guys that we were not going to be shooting, the hero ships that way. We still did use the miniatures for a lot of the background ships and stuff like that, and that we could sort of track in. And, and then that's the beauty of these guys. They said, okay, well, we'll repurpose it stuff. And so for the shot of the Arizona on the underwater, they took a chainsaw to it and put barnacles all over it, and that sort of thing. So they're not precious about these things, thank God. But yeah, it was a bit bittersweet because that was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, well, compositing has pretty much gone from photochemical and optical into digital, and now
miniatures are moving that way too.
And I guess Jurassic on the creature side was kind of the moment on that. But so yeah, that was kind of it. But we still use miniatures a lot, and I still use miniatures for even Terminator Salvation. We did a couple of big exploding buildings that way and stuff, and we still work with 3210 and do miniatures. But it was a bit bittersweet. It sort of felt like a era change.
Yeah, I imagine you've been through a few of those. So Speed 2, did ILM do the big boat explosion at the end of the movie?
I don't remember. I wasn't on that show. I think we might have been doing nothing.
I just remember Todd Vazari. He had his old website, VFX HQ, back
Yeah,
in the day. And I just remember reading up on how they snuck in the cow from Twister into the explosion at the end of that film. And yeah,
that was
because
the other thing I would say about our current lives as visual effects artists. You know, back then, like when we were doing episode 2, there was these really improbable creatures called shacks. They were like large grazing cows that
oh yeah, yep.
were frolicking in the background of a romantic scene between Padme and Anakin on Naboo. And I freaking thought these were the craziest looking things ever. And so I said to the artists on the Clone War unit, which was one of my units, I did the Clone War and the Droid Factory sequences, the Clone War battle sequence after they leave the thing. I was like, guys, if you can sneak a burning shack into the back of any of these shots, don't tell me it's there, but I'll give you $20. You know, sort of.
Well, I was talking to Jeff Oken, and he loves putting penguins in all his projects wherever he can as well. So
yeah, we used to have more time to do that and do gag takes and that sort of stuff. And we did in Iron Man, we were able to put Captain America's shield in the back of one shot, but we kind of had to confess it when they decided they'd make that a trailer shot.
right.
And of course, given what happened with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's like, wow, okay, well, they
Yep.
should have been there actually.
That should have been, yeah.
It is something that you just don't have as much time for now. The time that you've got to turn around a shot is a lot.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'll just ask 1 or 2 more questions, but I guess just for everyone listening who might want to get some kind of key advice from you, I guess like one thing I love asking whenever I speak to studios or supervisors is to do with hiring, because I think this is a really beneficial question. Like, have you found any like really big red flags when you interview or your team interviews a lot of artists, like things that are commonly coming up that usually cost people their job when it comes to...
I have to say I'm probably more out of touch on the interview process than It's funny because I actually did an XLab interview a few days ago, and I was like, wow, this is the first interview I've done in 15 years, I would say. Because when I was CG Soup, I would of course do tons of interviews with TDs and stuff like that, and so it's sort of redundant, but you know what? It's personality stuff, right? It never really changes. And I think you want to, if someone comes across as really arrogant, and they're like, you sort of say this or this and they end up arguing with you on something that really isn't important particularly. And it's not like you want a yes man. In fact, I would say the opposite. I want someone who'll be questioning and that sort of thing. But if they become belligerent about some silly thing, then that is... You're like, oh, okay, well, how are they going to fit in stuff like that? And then the other thing is, it's really a problem if you get 5 or 10 reels and they maybe 2 or 3 of them have the same shot, right?
Yeah.
Given project, and the person doesn't say, okay, on this shot, I did the particle effects and I was responsible for this aspect of the shot. You've got to be able to speak to your shot, and you've got to be able to say, this is what I did and this is how I did it. When I did the phone interview from ILM, it was a pretty interesting interview committee. It was like, I think Joe Letteria was on it, Steve Rosenbaum was on it, John Burton was on it, Doug Smythe was on it. It was like, what I now realize were a bunch of pretty heavy hitters. And one of the things they'd asked me on Beyond 2000, one of the shots I'd done was this sort of sphere that comes in and refracts a ship. And it was kind of challenging to do because, they was using my alias, I guess it would have been.
Yep.
And so they said, how did you do this? And, hey, I'd done it pretty much everything on that shot down to the compositing. Actually, it had gone through our compositing system, I think. But I ended up writing a compositor for Beyond 2000 because we couldn't do the volume quick enough if we just used the box for it. So I was able to sort of speak to, this is what happened and this was the struggle I had to get it to look this way and stuff. And so it was an impressive looking shot and I really knew what I was doing. And so I felt like that was a key thing that helped me get the job. The confidence with it, which I kind of knew what I was doing. And so you kind of want to be able to demonstrate that, and you want to be able to own the stuff on the reel and be able to explain it and that sort of thing. So I think that that's really important. It's kind of weird for us because ILM look for someone with a lot of experience. And so, I would say that my main recommendation would be go to a smaller house exactly as I did and you did.
Mm-hmm.
You're working, doing everything.
Yep.
You're on set probably. If you're shooting a commercial, you might be doing some compositing, you might be doing some modeling, I was the worst animator in the world and I had to animate. I was so happy when
I was the worst animator in the world. Thank you.
You didn't see my FIFA commercial from the early 90s. It was pretty bad. But anyway, it's great to have that experience because you end up talking to animators and working alongside animation soups, and sometimes you have to weigh in on animation issues. So it's good to even though I couldn't do it myself, just have a knowledge of animation and obviously and being an animation fan as well. But so small house for sure. And then when I first got into the industry at ILM, as I mentioned, we were all project hires, and I wanted to really make movies. That was my reason for being there. As I mentioned, we became kind of sexy in the rock stars of the 90s, not sexy in an attractiveness way. But, then a lot of people got in there because it was a good living, frankly, and it was really interesting. I would say now you can still do that, but it's a rough industry, and so you really want to do it. So I would say do it. You've got to get in there for the passion of making movies. Again, we're definitely in the position that we were when I first joined the industry, and it's like, I just want to make movies, it's not, and I think if you do that, you'll be successful, and your love of the process, your love of making the best shot you can and making the shot the best that you can will help you win the day, I think.
That's really great advice. No, thank you for that. I agree. I mean, I always say that start as a generalist and then specialize, because at least then you'll have a full understanding of the pipeline and what everyone else did, rather than, when I first moved to the US, I did experience that a bit, where I'd ask someone to do something other than Sparks. They're like, no, that's what I do. And it's just like, come on, like, smaller countries, you kind of have to do it all in the beginning. Yeah. So the final question, which I think is like one that I'd love to hear, is what's your opinion, like, let's say for effects TDs or lighting TDs, like, do you think it's really important for technical directors to have some coding ability to learn how to script and do that sort of thing?
When I first joined ILM, I had a programming background, right? In fact, my entree to MPC was I'd actually learned UCSD Pascal at school, and the Mirage, which was this weird video geometry wrapping.
Yeah, it rings a bell.
From the late 80s. That was written to be programmed in Pascal, and they had this giant box at MPC because MPC could afford to buy every piece of new equipment, and that was kind of their edge. But of course, even by the time they hired me, the thing was almost out of date because you could start doing that in Alias by then, or Wavefront. So I had that background, and I sort of started in systems, actually, even in CG. And when I came to ILM working on Star Trek 7, they had a bunch of seashell scripted pipeline. So ILM, didn't grow as much of their own software. They pretty much did the extra bits and the glue, which is, I think, is still a good way of working, honestly, where you're doing the stuff that the software can't do. That's where you put your effort, right? Rather than re-engineer stuff that you can buy something to do. So, and one of the feedback I got from my CG soup on the show was like, oh, Ben seems reluctant to dive into the scripts. And I was like, oh, God. Well, A, it was negative feedback, which was never good, right? But B, it was kind of true, honestly. So I sort of said, I looked then for opportunities on the next project I was on. And I think when that finished, I joined the crew of Casper for their last push. And then I went on to Lost World. Oh, no, it was Twist Up, that's right. But I kind of looked for opportunities to do scripting so I would get a control of the script. So I was like, oh, he'll never do that again. Now, the irony of all this was, even though I was involved in ILM shift from C Shell to Python scripts and actually did a lot of the programming on that, I still know C is probably the best. C scripting is still probably the language I'm most comfortable in using to this day, other than maybe RenderMan,
right.
Shader language. But as a soup, of course, I don't tend to do that much. But yeah, I think it's really useful to have scripting and programming. I don't think it's essential, and honestly, a great eye will get you a long way regardless. But if you start poking around with Katana or something, particularly at most big companies, there's going to be a bunch of bolt-on stuff, right? That, that is used for, let's say, sequence-based lighting. And it's good to be able to look under the hood and get yourself out of trouble. I like to run a few shots every year. Like I ran a couple of shots on Rogue One. Actually, maybe just one. I ran one shot on Rogue One. And on the Transformers movies, I sometimes dive in and do a couple of shots. And on Noah, I had to pick up a couple of shots. So I do like to keep a little bit abreast. And it's funny, though, you find, oh, wow, I'm ending up having to open up this thing and debug why I can't get my, you start with a shot, oh, this will be easy. It's only got 5 spaceships in. And then suddenly they add, oh, we need a crowd of X-Wings in the background. And you're like,
great.
So I'm not just throwing lights in anymore. Now I have to get this thing to render in the pipeline. So, yeah, absolutely would say it's a big advantage, and definitely you don't want to be afraid of it. That's for sure.
That's awesome. Thank you again for taking the time. It's been really great to chat about all this stuff, and especially to get some insight into, the decades of experience that you've got. So thanks again.
No worries. It was a pleasure. Great talking to you.
Okay, so what do you think? I hope you enjoyed this episode. Special thanks to Ben for taking time to chat and share all of his amazing insights. If you want to check out the show notes, which contain links to much of what we discussed, as well as great quotes from the episode and loads more, go to alanmckay.com/101. And you can also click on a link to go to iTunes if you would like to leave a review for the podcast. And this will take 2 minutes to do. And leave a review on iTunes today, right now. Go ahead. And ahead of time, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. So that's it for this episode. Next week, I'll be back talking with Bay Rate, who has an interesting career now working in VR, creating interactive comics. Previously, he's worked for Valve Software, and what was really interesting to talk to him about was he was the 30th employee at Weta, working on Lord of the Rings and being responsible for creating Gollum. Lots of great insights and a really great episode. I think, unless I'm wrong, Ben Snow was 30th employee at ILM, which is kind of a weird coincidence, and I might have been wrong about that. But remember to shoot me an email with your 90-day goals, and I'm going to hold you to this. I'm going to email you every 30 days for the next 3 months and check in to see how your goals are doing. I want to do this because I want to kick your butt and keep you accountable and really see some growth in you. And, I imagine a lot of you are probably not going to do this, so that's my challenge to you, to prove me wrong and do it, because, again, I want to see you make some big changes over the next 90 days. And again, we all need accountability partners, so I'm putting it out there. I need one too, so let's do this. That's it for now. Thanks for listening, and rock on.